And then from Salamis, they would go to Paphos, where they would have the encounter with Elymas, the magician. And then from Paphos, they would go to Perga in Pamphylia. And then they would end up in Pisidian Antioch. And that is where we see that they would go into the synagogues. They would speak the message of Jesus. The Jews would later on reject them, and it says that Paul would then turn to the Gentiles. And as he turns to the Gentiles, he is driven out of the city of Pisidian Antioch, and he would end up in Iconium, which is where we will pick up in verse 1. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 14, it says, "In Iconium they entered the synagogue of the Jews together, and spoke in such a manner that a large number of people believed, both of Jews and of Greeks. But the Jews," verse 2, "who disbelieved, stirred up the minds of the Gentiles and embittered them against the brethren." And before we move forward here, actually, let me grab, because they said the slides weren't working at first, but now it is. Let me grab this really quick. So looking at referencing back from the map, before we read more into the text, just a little bit about Iconium. From Antioch, you would see that Iconium is about 75 miles eastward from Pisidian Antioch. And what's significant about Iconium is that it was a very important part of the province of Galatia. It had two very important trade routes that passed through the city, and it also laid on the route, on the road that would lead to Ephesus. So this was a pretty significant city that Paul and Barnabas would have come to. And we see in verse 2, in verse 1 rather, that they would have entered the synagogue of the Jews together, and they spoke in such a manner. Another version would say that they spoke in such a way that a large number of people believed, both of Jews and of Greeks. And you got to wonder, what message did they speak that was so great to the point that all these people would have came to believe and obey in the gospel? Well, I believe it would have been the same message that they would have spoken in chapter 13 and all throughout the book of Acts. And that is simply just the gospel. And the point is, just preach the gospel. You know, the gospel is the best defense for itself. And so we see that and the result of them speaking or preaching the gospel, we see at the end of verse 1, it says that a large number of people believed, both of Jews and of Greeks. And the term believe literally just means to obey, as we look at it in the book of Acts. It literally means to obey. And in the book of Acts, for the most part, when it mentions that people believed, it means that they obeyed, and not the actual term that many in the world may think today. Oh, if I just put my faith in Jesus Christ, and if I just accept him in my heart, then I'm saved. But belief in this instance is to be obedient, and that involves baptism. But that wasn't the case for everyone. In verse 2, it says, "But the Jews who disbelieved stirred up the minds of the Gentiles and embittered them against the brethren." Now, I know in my version it says disbelieved, and in some of you all's versions, in the KJV and I believe the ESV, it would say the term unbelieving. But the word that is really supposed to be here in American Standard Version, it would say that it should be disobedient. Just as we talked about that belief means to obey. Well, on the contrary of it, in verse 2, it would say that these people, the Jews, would have disobeyed. They would have not wanted to obey the gospel. And we see in verse 3, it says, "Therefore they," being Paul and Barnabas, "therefore they spent a long time there, speaking boldly with reliance upon the Lord, who was testifying to the word of his grace, granting that signs and wonders be done by their hands." And a question for you all, why were these signs and wonders being done? What was so significant about this? They would preach the gospel and many would believe, but they say, afterwards they would have to spend some time there, and these signs and wonders would have been done. Why is that the case? What was so significant about signs and wonders being done? Clarification of God's word. That's right. That's right. And we see that in Mark chapter 16, verse 16 through 18. It was to confirm the word that was spoken, that these people would have come from God. Thank you for that. But we see in verse 4, it says, "But the people of the city were divided, and some sided with the Jews, and some with the apostles." And that even as these miracles and signs would have been done by Barnabas and Paul, that the people would have still sided with the disobedient Jews. And you got to wonder how, in a way, how blind can you be? As these things are happening right in front of your eyes, and people are still siding with the disobedient Jews, the people that did not want to believe or obey the gospel. And so, just interesting to look at. And it would say that the people would have been divided. Some would have been on the side of the Jews, and some would have been on the side of the apostles. And now that term apostle there wouldn't mean what we are probably thinking, with the 12 apostles and Paul also being that apostle. But the apostle here literally just means that one was being sent. In chapter 13, we understand that the Holy Spirit would have came to Paul and Barnabas to send them off to do the work that he had prepared for them. And this doesn't mean that Barnabas was an apostle like Paul was. He was just one that was being sent. So that's what it says there. Any questions or comments before we move forward? So looking at verse 5, after there was a division, after there was a dividing between the Jews as well as some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles, it was said in verse 5, "And when an attempt was made by both the Jews and both the Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat and to stone them, they became aware of it and fled to the cities of Lycaonia, Lystra, and Derbe, and the surrounding region." Have we ever heard of the term, the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Any of us ever heard of that term? What does that mean? Does anybody know what that phrase means?
Two factions that are seemingly against each other will combine their forces to combat something else.
Yeah, yes, sir. Yeah. Put two different parties, that necessarily do not like each other. They're going to come together. They're going to put aside their differences for that moment, to go against that common enemy. And the reason why I say that is because here we know that the Jews, they did not like, the Gentiles. They didn't want them to receive that message. So in that instance, they were kind of enemies with each other. But they would literally get together in verse 5. It says, "And when an attempt was made by both the Jews and the Gentiles and the Jews with their rulers." So both of these two are teaming up together. They're putting their differences aside, and they're going against the real common enemy, if you will, which would have been Paul and Barnabas, or in other words, Christians. And so we understand that God's plan is for Jews and Gentiles to be one. But we look in the same instance that Satan kind of uses the same way of trying to put these two together, but it's not for good intentions, but it is rather for evil. That Satan uses Jews to stir up the Gentiles, which would have been their enemy, if you will, to attack their greater enemy, which in this instance would have been the followers of Christ. And that is kind of how it is today. The Christians that stand for truth are double teamed by both the religious and irreligious of society. If you're truly standing for truth, then there's going to be opposition from all different sides. And so we have to be prepared, again, just to stand for the truth. And Jesus kind of prepares us for all of this, that persecution will increase because you are simply just not of this world. John chapter 15, verse 19, as Jesus is speaking here, he said, "If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, because of this, the world hates you." And so I don't say this for none of us to be scared, but it's rather for us to be prepared and continue on in the fight. And we see that is exactly what Paul and Barnabas would have done. Picking up in verse 6, It says, they became aware of it and fled to the cities of Laconia, Lystra, and Derbe and the surrounding region. And there they continued to preach the gospel. They didn't just give up, and here we see that they're running, but they're not running to just give up and run away. But they're going to different cities and they're continuing on to preach the gospel message. And so here you can just also reference again from the map here, as it says that they fled over to the cities of Lystra and Derbe. And we see this is also something that would have been said in Matthew chapter 10, verse 23 as well. As Jesus says, but whenever they persecute you in one city, flee into the next. And we see that that is the case here. Any questions or comments before we move forward? Any disagreements, anything I want to talk about? All righty. Picking up in verse 8. And actually before we read, we see that they would have fled over to Lystra. And just a little bit about Lystra, it would have been 18 miles southwest of Iconium, which would have been right there. And in 86, it was designated as a Roman colony, but this was completely different from the city of Iconium. Its inhabitants, the inhabitants of Lystra, still spoke a vernacular language during the first century. We look at, in terms today, people that are from the South in America, instead of saying you all or all of you, what do we say? Y'all. And so that's one example, and I haven't heard this lately, but when people reference soda, the people that are from the Midwest, they say pop. And I'm glad, and that's hopefully not none of you all, because if you come up to me asking for a pop, then it's going to take me a minute to know what you're talking about. But so that is examples of a vernacular language, and that is what we see, what we're going to see actually for the people that are in Lystra. And so picking up in verse 8, at Lystra, a man was sitting who had no strength in his feet, lame from his mother's womb, who had never walked. This man was listening to Paul as he spoke, who, when he had fixed his gaze on him and had seen that he had faith to be made well, said with a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he leaped up and began to walk. Question was, well, what did the man do once Paul told him what to do? These were simple instructions just to stand up. Well, this man, he demonstrated his faith and he leaped up. And this may not seem like a big thing for some people, but this man, he has never walked in his life. It says he was lame even from his mother's womb. And so this is something great. This is a miracle. And again, this man, he demonstrates his faith by his obedience to what Paul had told him to do. And we kind of see the same thing in Acts chapter 3 as Peter would encounter, again, another man that was lame even from his mother's womb, I believe. Now, it doesn't mention this man's faith in Acts chapter 3, but again, it's that same concept of being raised after not being able, not walking since his birth. And so we see belief is very important. And it's important, when we pray for different things. But belief is really important and, however, really necessary, rather, for the healing of the soul. So it's more so what's on the inside that we ought to keep in mind rather than the outside. Any questions or comments?
Faith truly is trusting. When we say we put our faith in God, we're trusting Him. But true trust or faith in God would then result in following what God says. And you have a picture of that in this man. He has faith in Paul, has faith in what he's seen. And so when Paul says, "Rise up," man hasn't walked in who knows how long. But to make the effort, he's put his trust, and what results from that trust is following through on what is stated. So that's why there's that direct connection between faith and obedience throughout the Gospels and throughout
Okay. Oh, yeah. Yes, sir. Appreciate that. So for those that didn't hear, Brother Josh was pretty much talking about the difference between, what was it, faith and, was it belief? No.
Well, just how faith ties
just-
into your obedience.
Okay, yeah. So how faith ties into your obedience. That this man's faith, it was really important. He believed in, what Paul was saying, or that he had, or what Paul had told him to do. And so, we see that faith is definitely important in that aspect. Thank you for that, Josh. Any other comments? Is that?
Yeah, I would just say that it's also interesting. You kind of compared it to the Acts 3 story, and we talked about, Josh talked about this, how when it mentions the faith that healed the man in Acts 3, it was Peter and John.
It was the apostles.
And when you look at where that happened, that was at the temple, right? That was in Jerusalem, where surely you would think that there would be faith of not only this man, but all the people around him. Here, you see, the people's reaction to when this happens, they start calling them the names of these Greek gods.
Yeah.
So you can see the environment that this guy's living in is not one of faith in God. And so the fact that it mentions his faith is even more astounding, that Paul was able to look at him and see this guy had faith way outside of Jerusalem, way outside of the temple grounds.
Yeah.
In this environment. And I think that makes it even more powerful.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. So for those that didn't hear, Zach was pretty much saying, how going back to Acts chapter 3, as Peter would come up to this man that was literally sitting beside the temple in Jerusalem, that, it doesn't mention his faith. And you would think that there would have been that faith there, seeing that he is in Jerusalem. He is right by the temple. But his faith isn't mentioned there. But it is, however, mentioned here all the way in, Lystra? So all the way in Lystra, which would be way outside of where Jerusalem is. And so his faith is definitely important in that aspect. Thank you for that, Zach. Any other comments before we move forward? All righty. Picking up in verse 11, and this is after this man would have been healed. It says in verse 11, when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they raised their voice, saying in the Laconian language, the gods have become like men and have come down to us. And they began calling Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And it says in verse 13, the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. Again, going back to that whole vernacular language, that they had their own sort of language that they were speaking here. And we kind of see that in verse 11, that really Paul and Barnabas did not know what they were saying, because these people have their own language. So in that instance, as they were saying, the gods are coming down to us, Paul and Barnabas do not know what they're saying. But looking in verse 12, looking at a couple of notes here regarding verse 12, we'll say that the local Zeus and Peletes, was portrayed on reliefs as an elderly bearded figure. And because he is sometimes depicted with a young male assistant, the identification by the people of Lystra of Barnabas as Zeus and Paul as Hermes, as he was the bringer of the word, this suggests that they thought that the two men were functioning in the way that they would have envisioned their gods to have acted. And I guess in some instances they looked. The bearded Zeus was the initiator of the action, and Hermes was his agent in carrying out the action. And so we see literally after they're saying, the voices of these are gods, these are Zeus and Hermes here. They began calling Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes. And then in verse 13, it would say that even the priest of Zeus would come down and bring these offerings to sacrifice to these people. And it would say some more, and this is from the Archaeological Study Bible, in verse 13, the response of the Lystrans may be traced to the following legend. And there was this legend that said that Zeus and Hermes once visited the Phrygian hill country disguised as ordinary men. They were turned away from 1,000 homes, but finally they were welcomed into an elderly home of a couple. And so they would take this couple's house and they would make it into this this temple, and they would have destroyed everyone that had rejected them. And so if these people from Lycaonia would have, Lystra would have understood this story that they probably believed, then, you know, they're looking at Paul and Barnabas and they're saying, look, this is probably what's going to happen again. These people are disguised as the gods that we know as being Zeus and Hermes. So we're going to treat them right. And not only that, we're going to give them praise. We're going to offer all these different things. But what do we see that Paul and Barnabas do after hearing what had happened? That they were trying to give them these different offerings and sacrifice to them and give them all these praise. What do they do after that?
Try to get them to stop.
Try to get them to stop. And it's nothing, you know, that, you know, they're not saying, oh, well, y'all quit that. We're not gods. We see in verse 14, it says, but when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their robes and rushed into the crowd. You know, this is not a small matter that they are doing. They're tearing their robes. They're like, whoa, what are you doing? You know, so this is not a small matter. They're really trying to say, look, don't do this. This is not good for you all to do this. You know, you look at, you know, some other people, they would have probably liked this. They would have like, man, these people are sacrificing to me. I'm someone important. You know, I get all this honor. Man, this life seems good. But that is not the case for Paul and Barnabas. They would go through such extremes, and I would say that they didn't want to steal God's glory. You know, if you look 2 chapters before, remember Herod the king, he would have died for pretty much not doing this. You know, as he would have came down to these people and he delivered an address to them, and then it says, you know, that he didn't give God the glory. So the angel of the Lord pretty much struck him, and he died. And so we see that, you know, that King Herod, he was a pleaser. I mean, he liked to please other people. He didn't strive to please God. But we see that Paul and Barnabas would have strove to please God and not getting the glory for themselves. And we'll see as we read further the glory that they would try to give. And that would be to God. Picking up in verse 15, as they tore their robes and they were crying out, they said, man, why are you doing these things? We are also men of the same nature as you, and preach the gospel to you so that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. Verse 16, in the generations gone by, he permitted all the nations to go their own ways, and yet he did not leave himself without witness, and that he did good and gave you rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. So here we see that Paul is giving the glory where it ought to go. That is to God, because God is worthy of all glory, all honor, and all praise. And he kind of starts with 5 things here. He says, look, you all need to turn from this idolatrous behavior. It's vain. It's empty. It's not benefiting nobody. These people, well, your gods, they're not real. You know, so he says, look, turn from this vain idolatrous behavior. And he says the solution, well, turn to the living God, the one who is living. He's not dead like the people that you're worshiping, the people that you look at as being gods. But he is the living God. He says, turn to the living God. Why? Because he made all creation. He made all creation. And at one point, you say that he allowed the nations to walk in their ways. But even as he allowed them to walk in their different ways, he left them a witness. He left them a witness. We understand that God's permissive will is not necessarily his ideal will. That God may have allowed the nations to go their own way, but his will is for all men to be saved and come to him. And that would mean to be obedient to what he has for them and not worshiping these vain, idolatrous gods or people. And so he says, look, I left a witness for you. In verse 17, we look at that witness. He says that I did good for you. I gave you rains from heaven, and I gave you fruitful seasons, and I satisfied your hearts with food and gladness. And we see that God is the one that is giving all of these blessings. It's not Zeus. It isn't Hermes. It's God. He left them a witness. They're going about trying to worship this God of the sky named Zeus. But really, Jehovah God is the one true God. He is the one that is blessing them with these rains. He is the God not only of the sky, but he is the God of the whole world. And they need to realize this, that Jehovah God is the one true God. And we kind of see this same account. If you turn over to Romans chapter 1, I'll just turn there quickly. Romans chapter 1. I'll just read verse 18 here. We kind of see the same thing going on here as God left them a witness. In verse 18, it says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of man who suppress the truth in unrighteousness." Verse 19, "Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature having been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse." This is kind of the same thing, saying that, look, he left a witness, even for those that were not Jews, although that the Gentiles would have, they didn't have the same laws that the Jews had. They were without excuse because they had a witness. They had all these things that God has blessed them with. Wasn't Zeus, wasn't Hermes, wasn't none of these other false gods, but it was God. So they are without excuse, and God's ideal will is for all men to come to him. Jews, Gentiles, everyone. Any questions or comments before we move forward? Alrighty. Picking up in verse, let me see. Oh, yeah. So, and then picking up in verse 18, and even after, and going back to Acts chapter 14, looking back in verse 18, as Paul would have said all these different things, he made the point of, he said, look, you got to turn from this idolatrous behavior, turn to the living God. He made all creation. He allowed the nations to walk in their ways, but he left a witness. So he's saying all these different things. But it says in verse 18, even saying these things with difficulty, they restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. And so even after Paul and Barnabas, they would have tore their robes. They would have been going out into the crowd screaming, no, do not do this. They're with difficulty, they're trying to restrain these people from offering sacrifice to them. But it says even after they heard that, like sermonette, if you will, even then they still would not listen. They still wanted to offer these sacrifices to them. And so, so that is that. Any questions or comments before we move forward in verse 19? Yes, sir, Brother JD.
You got a look at the scene of what's happening, and there's a miracle obviously performed, and there's an excitement in the crowd.
Mm-hmm.
They're looking at Paul and Barnabas as these gods. The priest of Zeus is trying to create something else. There's a lot of dysfunctionality going on, right? And who's leading? They're trying. This crowd is stirred up, right? And I think in verse 19 it's interesting to see how easily the crowd goes a separate way.
Oh yeah.
Because someone's looking for, this crowd's looking for leadership in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
And whoever's the loudest voice seems to be the one that pushes them in a certain direction.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Chaotic scene happening right now.
Yes, sir. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. It's like they don't really have any true direction, that is the people of Lystra, and they're trying to find this leadership, someone to lead them. And they, see Paul and Barnabas as, man, these are gods, man. Definitely we're going to follow them. We're going to offer sacrifices to them. But, Paul and Barnabas is like, no, this is not the case. And so we look in verse 19 how easily influenced, if you will, that they would have been. It says in verse 19, but Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having won over the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. And so we see that these disobedient Jews would have traveled, again, they are coming from Iconium to Lystra. So again, Iconium is right there, and they're going all the way down to Lystra. They would have traveled around 18 miles to look for Paul. Now, this is not them just, it wasn't enough for them to just ignore the message of what Paul had for them. Look, no, they're going to persecute. They're going to try and kill Paul. And not only them, but we see that also where was it going to? Verse 18, even the Jews that were from Antioch. And Antioch, again, is way over there. So they're going all the way from Antioch to Lystra to, again, not just ignore the message, no, but they're going to persecute Paul. They're going to stone him. And that would have been about 93 miles to Lystra. And they were all moved because of their jealousy. And so we see that they are motivated. They had the wrong intentions. But nevertheless, you put together 93 miles and you put together 18 miles, it still would not have added up to how much Paul would have traveled in his pursuit of persecuting Christians. Again, he traveled from Jerusalem to Antioch, and that would have been about 140 or 150 miles just to persecute Christians. But also I would like to add, that Saul, he had I guess he had good intentions because he had a zeal for the Lord. So he was trying to do the right thing. Although, he didn't really know what he was doing. Versus the Jews here, that they're just moved by jealousy. They're just moved because they're disobedient. They had wrong intentions versus Saul in that instance. He had the good intentions when he tried to persecute Christians. So that is that. And so we see that the Jews, they are the one, I guess, just in this instance, that they're the ones stirring up trouble for Christians. Now the Greeks, the Gentiles, they are getting together with the Jews, but we see that the Jews are really the one that looks like they're leading this. And we see that they would have stoned Paul, and that would have been something that the Jews would have naturally done. Gary?
Just to echo J.D.'s good thoughts, it is amazing to me, and this is really only talking about a few days difference here, and how amazing crowds can be so fickle. And they're going back and forth. I mean, you look at verse 5. They wanted to stone them, but they got away and they didn't stone them. Verse 11. They think they're gods and they want to make sacrifices to them. I mean, they build them up. And then, to your good point, verse 19, they want to stone them. And Paul is near death after being stoned. I mean, it's just amazing the back and forth. And J.D. made that point, but it happened in such a short amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
It just went all over the place.
Oh, yeah. No, definitely. So again, they're easily influenced, to the point, Paul, he got away last time, as he would flee to another city. But now, he's actually stoned. They drag him out of the city. And they would have supposed that he was dead. And I'm not really going to get too much into that. We don't have the time. I'm not sure if he was dead or he was just unconscious. We don't know. It just says that they suppose that he was dead. But it would say in verse 21, verse 20, but while the disciples stood around him, he got up and entered the city. The same city that he would have been stoned in. He would have entered the city again. So Paul, he has gusto. But it says that the next day he went away with Barnabas to Derbe. So again, he's going about preaching the good news. And it says in verse 21, after they had preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch. And what did they do? They were strengthening, verse 22, the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith and saying, through many tribulations, we must enter the kingdom of God. And if you look at how they actually traveled, so let me see. So Paul was persecuted. He was stoned in Lystra. Yeah, so he was stoned in Lystra. And so after that, he goes back to the city and he goes throughout all the cities strengthening the brethren. So literally, he could have came back after his so-called mission was supposed to be done. He could have literally just came back to Antioch. He could have took this route right here, which would have been a lot easier. But he took the time out. He took the longer route to go all the way around. And as he went all the way around, he went back to all those cities just to strengthen the brethren. And we're not sure how Paul would have looked, but he probably wouldn't have looked presentable as he was doing this. He just got stoned. So, if he's probably bloody, he's got all these marks and everything. But he goes throughout these cities strengthening the brethren. And he goes on saying that through many tribulations, we must enter the kingdom of God. And so he kind of just hones in on that point that, look, you're going to have tribulations. There's going to be persecution, but continue on in the faith. And it says in verse 23, when they had appointed elders for them in every church, having praying with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. And so just something quick question. What were some of the requirements for the elders in the Bible that we read about in Titus and Timothy? What were some of the qualifications? Husband of one wife, okay. Apt to teach. Not a novice. And there were many others that we read about, but I want to hone in on the fact that being not a novice was something very important. And some find it remarkable that elders could be appointed so soon here. That this church would have, it would have just started. Especially given the qualifications laid out in Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 3 that, you're not to be a novice if you're trying to be an elder. But it should be taken into consideration that this first journey of Paul's likely lasted for about 4 years, which would have been from AD 44 to AD 48. And also many of the first converts, they would have been either Jews and or God-fearers. And they would have already been well on their way to meeting the requirements of shepherding God's people. Husband of one wife, not a novice. Now, in a sense that, they're new to the Christian faith, yes. But even before then, as they were Jews, as they were God-fearing people, they would have presented themselves as being mature. So any questions or comments before we move forward? I know we're running out of time. Kenny?
Yeah, I think one of the things you have to remember is we're not given a good sense of time in this. We don't know how long it takes them to go from Antioch to Iconium to Lystra to Derbe. But the thing that is interesting to me is the untold story here that has to be happening is that people are not only opposing him, but people are also being converted because there are disciples there that are surrounding him and trying to make sure that he didn't get beat up anymore. And by the way, what he does right after he gets beat up, he goes back to that town, and then he goes to all the other towns that he had problems.
Yeah.
He doesn't let that stop him.
Doesn't let that stop him.
It seems to energize him.
That's right. Just real quick, just looking at verse 27. 27, it says, when they had arrived and gathered the church together, going back to Antioch, it said they began to report all things that God had done with them and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. So again, just going back to that concept of them giving God the glory. They're not saying that, oh, well, we did this, we did. No, they're giving God the glory for God doing this and God doing that. So that's all I have. Thank you for your attention, and Josh will pick up this next Sunday, Lord willing.